Hello and welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes, episode number 137, Ace Parker. Now, for those of you who don't know the story of Ace Parker, he was a terrific multi-sport star. He wound up attending Duke University, where he played baseball and football. Back during his days, the 1930s and the 1940s, baseball was the king of sports, and that's where Ace had hoped he would land. However, his football talents could not be overlooked. While he starred on Duke's baseball team, he really excelled on the gridiron. In fact, he was so good for the Blue Devils that he was actually in contention for the Heisman Trophy while quarterbacking Duke from 1934 through 1936. But again, it was baseball that caught his fancy, and it was baseball that he pursued when he signed with Connie Mack and the Philadelphia Athletics. Ace was a part of the 1937 and 1938 Athletics, but playing part-time and only hitting 179 during those 2 years did not speak of a long career. So Ace decided to give football a shot, and wow, what a difference. In 1937, Ace suited up for the NFL's version of the Brooklyn Dodgers, and he immediately made an impact. In fact, over the course of his NFL career, he was named MVP, All-Pro, led the NFL in passing, and once he co-led the NFL in interceptions as well. Yeah, Ace played on both sides of the ball, a true 60-minute man. Joining me to talk about Ace today is my special guest, George Bozica, the president of the Professional Football Researchers Association. However, before we get there, just a couple of reminders. Please follow Sports Forgotten Heroes on X at SportsFHeroes, follow on Facebook, and wherever it is you listen, please follow, rate, and review. And as always, I thank you for your support. Okay, Ace Parker. Not only did he break in with the Philadelphia Athletics in 1937, that was the same year when he broke in with the NFL's version of the Brooklyn Dodgers. And he wound up in the Pro Football Hall of Fame a couple of decades later, 1972. Before that, in 1955, he was inducted into the College Football Hall of Fame. And here to tell us more about Ace Parker is my guest, George Bozica. George, welcome to Sports Forgotten Heroes. So glad you're aboard.
Thanks. Thanks for having me.
Thrilled. I know you have a great knowledge of football, and like I said, happy to have you here. And today we're going to talk about Ace Parker. And I want to start with this. What makes him such an important figure in football history?
Well, I think he's an important figure in football history because I think he was one of the best quarterbacks of the late 30s and early 40s. Sammy Baugh was one of his contemporaries at the time, and they sort of had a mutual admiration society for each other because, they each sort of said that they were the best, player that either of them had seen. So, for somebody like Sammy Baugh, who I think would be on some people's Mount Rushmore of quarterbacks,
Sure.
I think that's a great compliment. And that seemed to be a compliment of a lot of his contemporaries. Mel Hein and others said that he was one of the best all around players that they had seen in football at that time.
Mm-hmm. Well, interestingly enough, I think his decision to play football professionally was somewhat of an afterthought. His goal, if I follow the story correctly, was to be a Major League Baseball player. And that's sort of why I decided to do a podcast at this time of year on Ace Parker, because we are now transitioning from the baseball season to the football season. So I thought Ace would be a great topic. Um, why did Ace decide to give up baseball and pursue professional football?
Yeah, you're absolutely correct. I think, at that point in his life, I think that he thought baseball was going to be a sport. I mean, he was a great all around athlete in high school, played just about everything and played it well. He was at Woodrow Wilson High in Portsmouth, Virginia. He then moved on to Duke, and he was a great all around athlete there. Played football, played basketball, played baseball. Uh, and his love was baseball, though, and he thought that was going to be it. But he joined up with the Philadelphia A's during one of their, down periods. Because as we all know, it seemed that the Philadelphia A's during the Connie Mack years were either first and World Series champions or dead last in the American League. And he got him at a time that they finished seventh out of the eight-team American League of that time. And then the next year they finished dead last. And his lifetime batting average was a rather measly 179. So I think he decided rather quickly that football was a better sport for him. Although he continued his love of baseball throughout his life, and he continued to play, minor league ball and manage minor league ball, and even went on to be the head coach of the baseball team at Duke. Uh, and his, where he, basically, played all of his college ball.
I also um, think that from what I read, that even though he struggled in baseball, and baseball was, his first love, and he wanted to give football a go, he thought he'd only try football for a year. I'll give it a shot. I'll play a year, see what happens. Why do you think he had such, I don't know if this is the right term, a low opinion of himself as a football player? Um, that he didn't think of himself as a better football player and that he could actually make it in the NFL.
The only thing that I can sort of hypothesize is that he wasn't a very big guy. By modern standards, he was 5'10", about 168. I saw in one reference up to about 178. So, he wasn't a specimen by any means. But the thing I kept
Yeah,
reading about,
you know what? You know what? I take offense to that.
yeah, well,
He's pretty good.
I'm that same size, so I understand. I can joke about it. But, the one thing that he had, and I'm going to make sort of a Rudy comparison here, is he had heart, and that's what everybody said. He originally was going to matriculate to, uh, oh God, it wasn't Duke, Virginia Tech. He was going to originally matriculate to Virginia Tech, but he visited Duke and he met with Wallace Wade, who was the coach at Duke at that time. And Wallace Wade was one of the great college coaches. He'd won a number of national championships at Alabama. He then came to Duke, and he told Ace, he said, "Well, it's a good thing you're going to Virginia Tech because you want to make the team here."
Mm.
Well, that encouraged him to go to Duke and to prove Wallace Wade wrong, and he did. And he became a huge star at Duke. Actually, he got his nickname at Duke because a local sports writer said that he was their ace in the hole. His given name was Clarence. So that's how he got the nickname Ace. He said he was their ace in the hole. He could run, he could pass, he was a great punter. Whatever they needed, he came through.
And he
So
was a
I
decent,
think maybe there was that, and it may have just been, a love for baseball over football, and that's really what he wanted to do.
right. And he was a good ball player, a good
Yeah,
baseball player in college
yeah.
at Duke. The other thing I really find interesting, football, baseball, um, that he sustained his most serious injuries as a baseball player and not football. Um, how did those injuries affect his baseball days, and what kind of effect did they have on his football career, if any?
Well, he made mention in an interview I saw that you you didn't you had to play through being hurt back then. That wasn't a factor. And I think that was the attitude he had. It was all part of that determination that made him the great player that he was, is that, he played through those. And actually, it said that he had to wear a brace going into the 1940 season, which turned out to be his probably greatest season. He ended up being the NFL MVP that year. and he had to play with a brace because he had injured his leg playing baseball before the football season, and that was that was what turned out to be probably his greatest years was 1940 and 1941. So Brooklyn had winning records both those years after they had sort of struggled during his earlier years, and Jock Sutherland, the great University of Pittsburgh coach, became their head coach at that time, and with Jock, he got the most out of what he had. Was a real disciplinarian, strictly by the book. He had to do it his way, and he got a lot out of that team, including Ace.
Yeah, he did get a lot out of Ace. Ace, as we said, started off as a Major League Baseball player. You alluded to the fact that he wasn't all that good. I mean, his career batting average was 179. He did have two home runs, 25 ribbies, played 94 games, so it was a good sampling. He decides to leave the Athletics, heads over to the NFL with the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, before we get into his career with Brooklyn, I'd love, George, if you could take us back to that time and tell us a little bit about the teams in the NFL during that time, such as the Dodgers, the Pirates, and other teams during that period, and their relationships with the Major League Baseball teams by the same names in the ownership.
Well, based on my research, I really zeroed in on the Dodgers because I wanted to find out, Brooklyn Dodgers, obviously, Major League Brooklyn Dodgers. Really, no relationship between the teams. Actually, the Brooklyn Dodgers, NFL Brooklyn Dodgers, started as the Dayton Triangles, which was one of the original teams when the NFL was founded. So, but Bill Dwyer, a Brooklyn businessman, and John Depler, who was a player coach of the Orange Tornadoes, which is also an early NFL team, purchased in 1930 the Dayton Triangles and moved it to Brooklyn. And they played at Ebbets Field, just like the baseball Dodgers, but they also borrowed the Dodgers name. And this was interesting to me because I always knew that the Brooklyn Dodgers were named the Dodgers because that's short for trolley Dodgers.
Right, right.
You had to dodge the trolleys, I guess, back in the day in Brooklyn. But they were actually known during that time as the Robins, based on their famous manager, Wilbert Robinson. So they did eventually, obviously, take the name of Dodgers that we now know. But that's where they got their name, is they sort of, quote unquote, borrowed it from the baseball Dodgers, who, and as I read, it seemed like for Brooklyn fans, they used a lot of different names back then. I mean, it seemed like, some still call them the Dodgers and all that. So yeah, so there really wasn't any, tie in between the two, but they did play at Ebbets Field, which I found very interesting.
What kind of team were they? Tell us a little bit about that team. The Dayton Triangles becoming the Dodgers. From what I read, they weren't exactly a great team, particularly before Ace got there. So, what can you tell us about the
Yeah,
Dodgers? And
yeah.
maybe who are some of the other players on the Dodgers that we might recognize their names today?
Well, Bruiser Kennard played on the Dodgers. He was a teammate. It was interesting to me because actually a couple of former New York Giants actually purchased the team from Dwyer and Depler. And that was Chris Red Cagle and John Shipwreck Kelly. And you could probably do a whole episode on Shipwreck Kelly because, I mean, when I got into him, he was an interesting person. Somebody likened him to the Broadway Joe of his day. He came from a wealthy family, lived on Long Island in a mansion, and he was the kind of guy that he frequented places like the old established restaurants and night spots, and part of that, as they said, society structure in New York at that time with 21 and the Stork Club and El Morocco. He was good friends with Bing Crosby. Just some of the names of people. They said that he had photographs in his mansion of him with the Duke of Windsor, Onassis, Picasso, Hemingway, Clark Gable, Irving Berlin, Nixon, Bob Hope. I mean, he's a fascinating guy.
Sounds
And
like you hung out at Toot Shore a lot.
yeah, yeah, so he was, and he was an underground agent for the FBI during World War II, which is
Wow.
interesting too. So I mean, yeah, you could probably do a whole episode on Shipwreck Kelly. It was a side story, sort of a sidebar, but I thought this guy is really an interesting fella, and not a bad player. He actually led the NFL in receptions, uh, and in 1933 with 22. Just to show you, yeah, it was interesting. I was listening to your interview with Otto Graham about Otto Graham with Ken Crippen, and you were talking about the fact that why are players like Otto Graham or even an Ace Parker not appreciated today? And a lot of it is that there's a bias towards recent players, and there's also been all this numbers inflation and statistics inflation, and it's really hard to compare. So you have to compare players of that day with other players of that day. So here's a guy that led the league with 22 receptions. Now, the league lead is over 100 receptions. So it just was a different game, but he was he was a good player of his time, Shipwreck Kelly. So, yeah, yeah, actually, when Ace came to Brooklyn, he sort of felt like a country bumpkin, because, he wasn't used to the big city and everything. And, he did say that he learned, though, to frequent Toots Shores, which was a famous sort of quote unquote saloon in New York, where a lot of famous sports figures and entertainment figures would be there. On any given night, you would walk into Toots's and, you'd see Frank Sinatra or Jackie Gleason or Joe DiMaggio or Frank Gifford. And he always took care of these guys so that they weren't bothered, so they could go in there and have a drink, sit in a corner, and nobody would bother them because that was the kind of place he ran. I remember Jackie Gleason saying one time that he had lousy food, but they like to go there. So they like to frequent it, even though he had lousy food. It was a good place to go drink, I guess. So, but yeah, so, Ace did get into some of that. But going back to your original question, because I came way around there, is, they had nothing to do with the original Brooklyn Dodgers. And eventually, Dan Topping, who went on to be the president and the owner of the Yankees, bought out Cagle's interest. So there was a short period of time when him and Kelly were the co-owners of the Dodgers. And as a team, the Dodgers, didn't fare very well until that 40 and 41 season when Jock Sutherland became their coach, and that was sort of their peak years. And not to say Ace's performance throughout all those years was good. He was definitely Hall of Fame material, but he really the team and him really blossomed under Jock Sutherland.
And he got there in 1937, and he did. He made an immediate impact on the team. Quarterback, tailback, and like you said, he was an all-around player. He did so much. Tell us about the kind of player that that Ace Parker was, and just what kind of impact he did have on the Dodgers that first year.
Yeah, he was a great all around player, as you said, and I think it was part and parcel of the fact that he was running the old single wing at that point. So the tailback in that situation was handling the ball most of the time because he was usually a player that could pass the ball proficiently, run proficiently, and also punt proficiently, and those were all things that Parker did well. Just hearing about the kind of player he was, it sort of reminded me of if you step forward into the 50s and the 60s. I thought that he reminded me of what I heard through research about the kind of player Frank Gifford was for the Giants, or the kind of player that Paul Hornung was for the Packers. They were guys that could do a little bit of everything and do it well. And that was what Ace was. He wasn't necessarily, he said, fast, but he was quick. He was cerebral. He was very creative. And he was, they said, a great faker of the ball. And those are all things that, made him a success in that offense. And he did have, an immediate impact, statistically, and just somebody that the team could rally around and depend on, because that was just the kind of player he was.
Is there a player in today's game who you might be able to compare Ace to? And here's where I'm going with that. We went when Ace played, like we said, he ran the ball, he threw the ball. We went through a period where it was basically just pocket quarterbacks. Now we're getting back to, quarterbacks that can do so much. Lamar Jackson, the new guy for the Commanders, Jaden Daniels, yeah, even Josh Allen, and quarterbacks like that. Patrick Mahomes. These guys can throw the ball. They can run the ball, and I sort of think of Ace Parker in the same vein. Is that a fair comparison? That he's that style of player? Maybe you can't compare him athletically for
Yeah,
just how great those guys are, but
right.
he's the same style.
Yeah, I would say he was definitely in the vein of that. I mean, when you asked the question, the first person that came to my mind was Lamar Jackson, because Lamar Jackson can also beat you with your feet. And not to say that some of the others that you mentioned, like Patrick Mahomes. I mean, we've seen over the last 4 or 5 seasons that Mahomes can beat you with his feet also. He keeps the play going and he does stuff like that. Yeah, I don't think you compare the game, and I think that's part of the problem is the game has changed so much from what it was back then to what it is now. But yeah, I think that's why he was proficient, and I think that's why those, I think there's obviously a direct descendant line to those players.
Now, like we said before, he wanted to be a baseball player, really didn't succeed at it, figured, you know what, I'll try football. I'll give it a go. I'll play for a year. Um, was he surprised at how well he did play? Did he ever think that he would make such an impact and make an impact like he did so quickly?
I didn't see anything in the research that I did that indicated that there was any surprise. I think he, as I said, he just sort of came to the realization that this is where I belong. I thought it was interesting because he also mentioned that it was such a different game then, because he said it was much more laid back. He said they do everything in the morning and have their afternoons off, which I thought was amazing, because it's a 24/7 game right now. And the fact is he had to ask Connie Mack permission after his first year with the A's to go play football. And he got that permission. I can think of some modern athletes that have played two sports. Obviously, Bo Jackson, obviously Deion Sanders. Not so much in the football vein, but Danny Ainge, I know, played some baseball and also played for the Celtics. So, I mean, there have been some modern athletes that have been, really proficient in both sports. I was just really impressed when I read, the kind of things that he did in high school and college. Just what a great all-around athlete he was. I mean, I think that's the reason that made him a success. And you know, one thing, he batted 179, but he hit a home run in his first at bat. I mean, he yeah, yeah, he had an auspicious start, and you would think, oh my goodness, but sometimes that happens in baseball, and then so it was really something. And if you look at some of his numbers from his minor league play, he was a good player. He just for some reason, and maybe it was playing for the A's. I don't know. I can't think of a worse franchise that you could latch onto, than the A's back then. I mean, they've gone through their last sort of glory period, in the early 30s, when they had Jimmy Fox and all those guys. But then, he got there at a time when there was, some really lean years for, Connie Mack. I mean, he hadn't gotten to the, towards the end of his career yet, but, we all know that he probably lasted much too long because he was just stubborn about getting out of baseball. But yeah,
Well, well, Connie Mack was that kind of manager. The A's, the Philadelphia Athletics, had that kind of reputation. Heck, they had Joe Jackson,
yeah, yeah,
shoeless Joe Jackson, and he couldn't make it with the Athletics. And my gosh, he turned out to have a pretty decent career after he left that team.
yep.
Um, if Ace's college days were any sort of indicator of just how good a professional football player he would be, then he certainly underestimated himself. I mean, tell us about his career, what you can about his career at Duke, and the fact that he was actually a Heisman Trophy contender.
He was. He finished sixth in the Heisman voting in 36. That year, Duke went 9-1, conference champs. He had a 105-yard return versus North Carolina kickoff return, which is still a school record to this day. That's still a school record. And he was a consensus All-American. He's in the College Football Hall of Fame, and he's also in the Pro Football Hall of Fame. So, yeah, he may have underestimated because of his love of baseball and thinking that was a sport for him because, he was definitely, as the local reporter said, I can't remember off the top of my head. I would have had to write them down, but, I checked in the Duke Media Guide, those seasons, and his name constantly, in their media guide, they have a breakdown of their schedule, and then they put like the key players in each game, and Parker's name kept coming up game after game after game. So yeah, he most definitely had a great impact. He was also team captain in 1936, so obviously the players around him looked up to him also. So he was definitely the what made that team go. So there's without any question he was a great at Duke.
What kind of person was Ace Parker? Tell us about his life off the field and the kind of person he was.
From what I read in interviews that people had done, it just sounded like he was just a really, great guy. He was, in interviews that were done later in life, they said he was just a very pleasant person, answered questions, didn't sound like he had a big ego. And he was that kind of person. I mean, he said the biggest thrill in his life was making it into the Pro Football Hall of Fame. I don't think he thought that would be something in the cards for him. So I think he was a humble person and a good person. So I think that's what I read and what I gleaned from a lot of the interviews that were done with him and the kind of person he was.
All right, let's talk more about his skills on the field. First, if you can, evaluate him as a quarterback.
He said that because of his size, he didn't have the same skill necessarily of, say, a Sammy Ball, throwing the football because it was a much rounder ball back then. But he was still, very proficient with those. As I sort of said earlier, the things that made him who he was basically that, people kept saying he had a big heart, he was tough, he was versatile, he was a great all-around player. I got the impression that he got the most out of what he had because of his creativity and also the fact that, he was such a good faker and those aspects. And I think, if he did have some, maybe he wasn't the physical, specimen that, say, a Sammy Ball was, he was able to overcome it because of that determination. I think it's interesting, the story with him and Duke. And, when Wallace Wade sort of, in a roundabout way, maybe Wallace Wade knew what he was doing. Maybe he realized that, he wanted this guy, but the way he had to do it was, with some reverse psychology. But, that's who he was. And I think that what he brought to the football field as a quarterback was, that ability, that creativity and versatility.
As you were talking about this just now, another name popped into my head. A guy who, if people remember, that might also be a good comparison for Ace Parker when I think about physical stature and the running ability and all. Fran Tarkenton.
Yes. Yeah. I think that's another good analogy. I said I think there's a direct line through quarterbacks of that type of quarterback. And I mean, because of, I sort of came of age as a football fan during those 60s and 70s, I remember Fran Tarkenton as just, doing unbelievable things with his feet. I mean, things that I've never seen other quarterbacks do, Tarkenton would. He would just keep the play alive, running circles around the defense until he found an opening. And, he was just that kind of player. I haven't seen game film on Ace Parker to know if that's what he was doing. Everything is by, people that explained what he was like on the football field. And the thing I kept hearing was what a great all-around player he was. He could do it all. And he also, which we haven't even discussed, he also played defensively because, this was still during that period of the 60-minute men. And, he was one of those 60-minute players.
He had 7 career interceptions.
Yeah, he did. So, I mean, so they said he was also tenacious on defense and could play great on defense. So, and that's something that's not even a factor in today's game. I mean, people make a I guess, a very big deal about Otani in baseball because, he can do it all. He can pitch and he can also, hit and everything. But we don't see that in football. I mean, you don't see guys going both ways at all anymore. It's, it just, it's not part of today's game. It's a game of specialization.
Yeah, there's a gentleman, I'm sure you know, Chris Willis, and I want to try to get him on to talk about. He recently wrote a book called 60 Minute Men, and that's a part of the game that is no longer a part of the game, and Ace certainly mastered it. I mean, true 60 minutes. Not only was he on the field as a quarterback, he was there as a tailback, a punter, a defensive back. I mean, he did it all. So, like you did for me in evaluating him as a quarterback, and by the way, his second year in the NFL at quarterback, he led the league in attempts with 148 pass attempts, and he threw for 865 yards, 5 touchdowns. His high came a couple years later in 1940 when he threw for 10 touchdowns. Talk about, however, his abilities at tailback and the kind of runner he was. You sort of talked about it, but I mean, my gosh, the guy could run with the ball too. In 1939, he had 5 touchdowns. Um, Ran for over 300 yards in a season a couple of times. So talk about his ability at tailback.
Yeah, as I said, that he didn't consider himself fast. He considered himself quick, and he also considered himself creative and really good at faking. So I think that's how he overcame his size. Was I keep going back to the idea that I think he was a very smart player, and got the most out of that. I didn't see a whole lot written about his defense except for the fact of how many interceptions he had, and that and that he played both ways. But it just I think a lot of our evaluation of players from that era is based on what film may be available, which isn't obviously a ton, but it's also on the recollections of other players and things that they've said. I sometimes see they said when certain players made it into the centennial class, it was because, well, such and such, like a George Halas said this about them, and that seemed to carry a lot of weight back then. But I think it was pretty well from things I did read during the research that he was just really respected by not only his teammates but by his opponents. As I said, people like Mel Hein, great New York Giant, Wellington Mara said some things. Bruiser Kennard, his own teammate. They just all were so impressed with his all around ability, and I think he brought that to everything that he did. I feel like I'm repeating myself, but that's basically what I kept hearing was that he just had this great all around ability that really made him excel on the football field.
Well, I think one of the things that really can speak to just how good he was is the fact that he only spent 6 years in the NFL or 6 seasons in the NFL. Um, and he still made it into the Pro Football Hall of Fame, like so many of his fellow football players. He lost a good part of his career, prime years of his career during World War II. 3 full seasons,
Right.
1942, 43, 44,
Right.
prime years. One can only speculate, but what do you think Ace missed?
Yeah, he definitely did. He served at the Norfolk Naval Base during that time frame, and actually managed their baseball team because there was obviously service teams back then. He managed their team and also played. So but yeah, I mean, he lost probably. I mean, he was in his prime in 40 and 41, so you have to believe that he lost those years. Although he did come back. The Dodgers were a bit of a shambles by then. In 44, they had changed their name to the Tigers, but as everybody said that knew better, they were still the same old Dodgers. They finished 0 and 10. He played for the then Boston Yanks for a season. and then he finished his career in the All-America Football Conference with
How do you get into all that?
the football New York Yankees. So
Yeah. So
I always remember when I would talk to my dad who passed a couple years ago, and we would talk, old time baseball, and he was a huge DiMaggio fan, and he always said, "I wonder what DiMaggio or Ted Williams or Bob Feller would have done if they didn't miss the years, you know, to the war." He always talked about that. He said he always thought, DiMaggio would have probably had another 100 homers or more, more RBIs and stuff. And then he would also say, especially with the wartime pitching, he always threw that in. So, I got to believe that, he missed some prime years there during his time in the service, as they all did.
yeah, let's go back to the Dodgers for a moment. It's always fun to talk about what the league was like back then. It's a slight detour from Ace, but when he did come back, like you said, there were no more Brooklyn Dodgers. They left the borough. They moved to, of all places, Boston, and of all names, they became the Yanks, not the Yankees, Yanks. Tell us, why did they leave Brooklyn and how did they arrive at the name Yanks again in of all places, Boston?
Yeah, what I read is that they were the Yanks, and apparently they played part of their games at Fenway, but then they also played a game in New York. So they were like, in both, spots. One time I read that they were just called the Yanks, but then also, the quote unquote Boston Yanks. So yeah, it's just, one of those unusual things back then because there wasn't the stability with the franchises back in that era of the NFL that we have, nowadays. It's especially during the war, rather famously, because teams didn't have enough players, teams had to combine their resources, like the Steelers and the Eagles and the Steagles and the,
Eagles. I
the
love that name, the
yeah,
Steve.
and the Bears and Pittsburgh also known as the Carpets. So that was a sort of a common thing, during the war years because of the fact that teams were struggling, financially. They were struggling because they didn't have enough players. A lot of times these combined teams weren't very successful, but that was just part of the sort of instability of the league at times back in that time period. In fact, there's a really interesting Coffin Corner article. Uh, I'm, as you know, the president of the Pro Football Research Association, just to get a plug in for the organization. But
And tell us, the Coffin Corner is
Coffin
a
Corner is our official magazine, and there's an old archived article where there could be an argument, but it's easily discounted, but it makes for interesting reading. That you can make an almost direct line from the Dayton Triangle to the Indianapolis Colts, but it isn't identified as such, and the league doesn't does it. But it's just a fun article to read.
yeah, just like
There's a lot of twists. There's a lot of twists and turns and all this, but it's an interesting article to read, and I guess the best way to say it's a fun article to read.
you could also make the argument about the Dallas Texans.
Yes, yes.
Original Dallas Texans.
Original Dallas Texans. That yes,
Yeah,
yes.
yeah.
Play,
It's always fun.
had their only win here in my my town where I live right now, Akron, Ohio, at the old Akron Rubber Bowl on Thanksgiving Day. They said there were so few fans in the seats. They said the players could have gone up in the stands and shook every hand in the stand. So, yeah, I've tried to find a program for that game, and it's impossible to find. It's got to be one of the rarest programs around.
I'll have to turn you on to someone that just might be able to help you out. I did a podcast on the original Dallas Texans and a lot of fun there. Hey,
Yeah,
getting back to Ace. So he comes back from the war, goes rejoins the team. Now they're the Boston Yanks. He didn't get a lot of playing time. Wasn't he didn't do all that well. So he played for the Boston Yanks, and then that was 1945. In 1946, he finally made it to the Yankees. He left the NFL, for the new All America Football Conference and the
Yes.
New York Yankees. Yes, the AAFC had a team called the New York Yankees, and
Yes.
he was actually pretty good again. In fact, he led New York to a record of 10-3-1, a first place finish in the Eastern Division, threw for 8 touchdowns, rushed for three. Why did he leave the NFL if he still had that kind of talent? Because the AAFC was not all that bad. There were some decent teams, some good ball players. How was he convinced to leave the NFL and go to the AAFC?
From what I read, they said they sort of let him retire. I think he wanted to move on at that point. I think, he had been injury prone, with mostly the baseball career. And I think he was just, ready to finish his career at that point. It's interesting. They obviously lost to the Browns because the Browns won every AAFC title, but that was a pretty good Yankees team. They gave the Browns everything they wanted in the two championship games that they played, and that year they lost to the Browns 14-9. But it was actually a lot of former Brooklyn Dodgers players, a lot of the better players that were on that Yankees team that Topping was able to bring with him there, and Ace was one of those guys, and he did have that one sort of last hurrah getting into the only championship game he played as a professional, because his nemesis was usually Sammy Ball, and they always seem to get beat out by them in those good years that they did have.
Well, I was really interested in the fact that he did have a good season with the Yankees in 1946, and like we said, led them into the championship game against the Cleveland Browns, and they were just a powerhouse, an absolute powerhouse, and they proved that time and again, even when they entered the NFL a couple of years later. So, what I don't understand is though the Dodgers or the Yanks let him go, retire. He goes, he plays for the Yankees in the AAFC, has a decent season,
Yeah,
and then he decides to hang it up.
yeah, he
Why
decided
not
to
go on? It's not like he was 38, 39, 40 years old. He was still 34 or 35 years old.
yeah,
Why not go
yeah,
on?
yeah. I think that's one of those mysteries. I mean, I know that obviously his love of baseball, because I mean, after that, he did manage at the minor league level. He managed at Duke. He also was an assistant football coach at Duke too during that time frame. So, uh, I kept reading it. He always had that love for baseball, and maybe it was just a matter of wanting to move on with that part of his life at that point.
Interesting. Yeah. After his playing days were over, he returned to the game he loved, baseball. He actually coached in college at Duke and in the minor leagues. Can you tell us anything more about his days as a baseball manager? I think he even got in one of the minor leagues a Manager of the Year award.
Right.
Why did he? Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I read that he was manager of the year twice, I think, in the Piedmont League. Actually managed the Durham Bulls at one time. One of the more famous minor league teams, obviously. But yeah, he I think the thing that interested me so much was how much time he spent managing. I just was really impressed when I heard that. I knew he was obviously a solid baseball player, even though he didn't have a lot of success, in the big show. But I mean, he was obviously a solid player. But I was just really interested because, he seemed to be doing the managing thing, fairly early on. It just, I guess it just told me by association that he must have been a smart guy, must have known the game, and he was just a good leader in that regard. And maybe that's another reason why he was as good as he was on the football field too, was that leadership ability. Because I was just impressed with the fact, because a lot of times afterwards you hear about it, but I mean, he was doing it on an ongoing basis, on and off. Where I read that he was managing teams and also playing for teams. So I was sort of impressed with that, and actually sort of surprised that he was doing that as early as he was.
Mm-hmm. If there is one thing about Ace Parker that I have not asked you about that you think is important for us to know, what would that be?
I think we've pretty much covered everything. Uh, he did spend some time also as an NFL scout, which I also thought was interesting. In addition to his coaching and managing, he did do that. Uh, I I you asked a question earlier about what kind of person he was, and by all accounts, he was just a really good and pleasant person, humble, and I think that's the thing that was sort of impressed with me. Especially when you consider not all players, but some of our modern players, have quite an ego sometimes, and that from what I read, that wasn't who an Ace Parker was. He wasn't that kind of player. It was a different time. It was a simpler time, I guess, is the best way to put it. When he said that, it wasn't like today. By the way, this is an interesting fact. He died as the oldest living Hall of Famer. So, which is I think is interesting. He was the oldest living Hall of Famer when he passed. So I think that's an interesting sort of tidbit about him. He lived a long and full life.
He sure did. Well, speaking of the Hall of Fame, he was inducted into the Pro Football Hall of Fame in 1972. Now, many times I speak with guests about forgotten stars, whether it be in baseball or football or hockey, whatever it is, who we think should be in the Hall of Fame but are not. He's played, as we said, in the NFL for 6 seasons, the AAFC for 1 season. His stats do not blow you away. What makes him a Hall of Famer? I'm not doubting the fact that he deserves to be in Canton. I would never doubt that. But what makes him a Hall of Famer?
I think it's the fact that the success he had during that time frame, and I think, as I said, the testimonials of other players that he was one of the finest all-around players of that era. With Sammy Ball and some of the others. That I think that just the fact that he was considered such an excellent player, and I believe he was. As you said, his career was shortened also by the war years, which I think is sometimes taken into consideration. But yeah, looking at it, his numbers don't blow you away. But I don't see anybody that every year you see people that say, well, that person doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame, or that person doesn't belong. I've not heard that about Ace Parker. I never hear him in those conversations. I hear other names, but he's not one that I hear. So, and I think sometimes even that, personal feeling, I think that does a disservice to some players too. You always hear certain arguments about certain players. I've heard that argument about Floyd Little. He didn't have the numbers. I hear it a lot about Joe Namath, which angers me because Joe was my favorite player growing up, and I felt that he fully deserves to be in the Hall of Fame. I think there's more to Joe Namath than the number of interceptions he threw. There was a time period when every publication when I was a kid said there was no better quarterback in the NFL during that period. And, I think people sometimes, again, and I understand the arguments. It's not that I don't understand them, but I just sometimes think it does a disservice to some players that are in the Hall of Fame when people say, well, he doesn't deserve to be in the Hall of Fame. I just think that's a disservice.
Well, one of the cool things about the PFRA, the Professional Football Researchers Association, which you are the president of, is the Hall of Very Good. So
Yeah.
let's talk about two things here.
Yeah.
Tell me a little bit more about the PFRA, its mission, and how people can join. And two, tell us about the Hall of Very Good and what that is.
Yeah. If people want to, first of all, we have been in existence for 40 years. We're going to actually have our 50th anniversary in about 4 or 5 years here. One of our goals right now, too, is to reach 1,000 members by our 50th. It's a little goal that we have to reach 1,000 members. But you can go on our website. All you have to do is Google Professional Football Researchers Association or simply PFRA, and it will take you to our website. And we have a spot on the website where you can join. It's $35 a year if you live in the United States, $40 in Canada, and then we also have an overseas rate. I think it's the best money you'll spend if you're a football history fan or buff. A lot of our members are, obviously researchers, authors, writers, and just some that are just, as I said, history buffs. Part of the membership is you get our Coffin Corner magazine, 6 times a year. We have a convention, a national convention every other year. We've just announced that our national convention in 25 will be in Minneapolis, St. Paul. In years past, we try to have our conventions in NFL cities. We were in Pittsburgh last year. We've also been to Canton, Cleveland, Green Bay, Buffalo, New York. So we've been in a number of cities, and it's usually a full weekend with speakers, former players, and add-on activities that include, tours of football-related things in the areas, whether it's museums, stadiums, and all that. So I can't say enough about it. Our goal is to preserve the history of the game through research, and then disseminate that history and accurate, telling of the game. And as you said, one of our projects is the Hall of Very Good, where every year we go through a nominating and voting process to name players to our Hall of Very Good, which are players that have not been named to the Hall of Fame, but we feel are deserving of recognition. And we normally induct anywhere from 8 to 10 players a year. We've done that since, I believe, 2002. And a number of the players that we've named to our Hall of Very Good have ultimately been elected to the Hall of Fame, which is always a pleasant thing to see, because it's sometimes pleasant to see those guys that have, fallen through the cracks finally get their recognition. And we're proud of that. But yeah, that's what the Hall of Very Good is, and it's member centric, because members can make the nominations, and then the committee, whittles down the list to 20, which we actually are just in the process of doing for this year's class, and the voting will be starting on that soon here.
Awesome. Well, George, thank you so much for telling us a little bit more about the PFRA, the Hall of Very Good, and for sharing so much about Ace Parker. Truly appreciate you taking time out of your evening to join me here on Sports Forgotten Heroes. Really want to thank you a whole lot.
Thank you, Warren. Thanks for having me on. I really enjoyed it.
Anytime. Over the course of his career, Ace Parker was named NFL MVP in 1940. He was first-team All-Pro in 1938 and 1940, and was second-team All-Pro in 1937 and 1939. And in the AAFC, he was named a second-team All-Pro in his only season with the New York Yankees, 1946. In addition to his inductions into the Pro and College Football Halls of Fame, Ace was also inducted into the North Carolina Sports Hall of Fame, the Virginia Sports Hall of Fame, and the Duke University Sports Hall of Fame. And while he excelled on the football field, his first love was baseball, and after his playing days were over, he returned to Duke, where he coached the baseball team from 1953 through 1966. Hey, if you're interested in joining the Professional Football Researchers Association, it's a great group. I'm a member. I truly do encourage you to do so. Check it out at profootballresearchers.com. That's www.profootballresearchers.com. Thanks again to George for being here, and thanks to all of you for listening, and I'll see you next time on Sports Forgotten Heroes.